Hi, Alan Hadley with My Photo Networks. Thanks for joining me for this next video tutorial. Today, we're going to be working on our focus spotlight. We're going to be shooting wind drifts. Now, it's something we see all the time, but do we really pay attention to the details of how the wind does what it does? It shapes and forms the snow in beautiful configurations. What we have to do as photographers is notice those details and photograph them. What we're going to be looking at in this video tutorial are different types of wind drifts and how the wind has done what it does, and focusing on creating images based on those designs. Okay, we are set up on this first wind drift that I found, and as you can see, it's very bright. There's a shadow that's actually coming toward us, so we're shooting into the shadow. But what I want to talk to you about briefly is the actual setting up of your camera so that you can create an image. Before you actually set up or shoot an image like this, really look at the details of the image and photograph everything that it has to offer. The design of this wind drift is obviously naturally, produced. So it's not something that you want to go in and change or anything like that. What you want to be able to do is just focus in on the attributes that this particular subject offers you. For instance, the highlight at the top of the way the shadow's dropping over, the darker areas of the image, and of course all the texture and everything that's there. Now, I'm photographing this vertically, but the idea is when you're out shooting something like this on location, shoot it in a couple different ways and from a couple different points of view or perspectives so that you get the maximum opportunity with that subject. Okay, let's talk a minute about the equipment that we're actually using today. We're shooting with a D5000. We're shooting with a 17 to 55 millimeter lens. We're also using a polarizer and a UV filter on the lens. Now, as a standard, the UV filter should always be on your lens. The polarizer, we're using that to actually not only knock down the light, but to control the intensity of the light or the specular highlights. And what you'll find is under these conditions, shooting in the snow, a polarizer is really going to come in handy, and it'll help show the detail of the shot. Now, one of the things that you really want to pay attention to when you're shooting these types of subjects is the design of the image. Your composition is really important. Also, the direction of the light. We're shooting into the shadow, which means the light is actually coming from behind the subject. Shooting into the shadow is going to show us a lot of shape and form, so we always want to pay attention to that detail. Now, with that said, let's finish edit this image and move on to our next.
The next two images that we're going to take a look at focus more on the design of the image and the direction of the light. In this first image, all of our 5 elements of photography come into play. One of the most important aspects of this image is the composition of the image and the perspective. Obviously, we have our subject. What attracted me to this more than anything was the fact that there was 3 separate elements actually laying on top of this little snowdrift. When you're out shooting and you come upon something similar to this, pay attention to all those finite details. Your perspective and the composition, how you actually frame this in your camera, is going to be critical to the final outcome. Simply take a moment to stop and look at all of the attributes of the shot or of the subject and pay attention to those details and set yourself up in a perspective that's going to make all of those elements come together to create the image that you see in your mind's eye in the best way that you can. In other words, use the elements to actually create the strength of the image. What you must understand when creating a composition like this is that it is the elements within the image that create the strength of that image. So when you're choosing a perspective, when you're choosing a particular focal length, or you're choosing to shoot a particular subject, look at all of the details of that subject and make a determination whether or not it's strong enough to actually photograph. In more cases than not, what you're going to find is the simplest compositions are the most powerful. So limit the clutter, limit how much is actually in the image itself. That's the beauty of shooting this type of subject matter, is that by taking the required time, you can find beautiful compositions with very, very simplistic elements to create that composition. Let's take a look at our next image. Although very similar, yet different than our last, our contrast level is much stronger in this particular image because of the shadowing and the angle of the light. Very similar to the other without the other details, the little small leaves. So you can create a very strong composition just by using light and shadow, the angle, the form of this wind drift to be able to create an interesting composition. Now, one of the things I want you to pay attention in this particular image is the texture of the surface and the way the light's coming across and creating a hard shadow. Even though the shadow is dark, there's still detail within those shadow areas, which is very important. That's called dynamic range. So whenever you're photographing this, pay attention to those details so that you can record your image properly. When you get into post-processing, you'll be able to edit the image effectively and be able to retain all the detail of that particular image. Let's move on to our next image. In these next two images, you'll find that this is a different type of wind drift or a different type of blown snow. What we've done is actually include not only the texture of the snow, but rocks that were on the side of the road and a bush that was growing on the side of the road also. By adding these other elements into these next two images, what you're going to find is that you create a story or you create some type of feeling from the image. Now, if you'll notice in this first image, there's some shadowing and a lot of texture, and the direction of the light is really important here. What it's giving us the ability to do is to show that texture. The perspective and the focal length that was chosen to shoot this is really important also. In this image, I used a 12mm to 24mm wide-angle lens. That's very important, especially when you want to create a very dramatic image from something that's very simple and mundane. In this next image, what you'll find is that it's exactly the same location and the same subject matter. What we did was change our perspective and widen the shot or change the actual angle of view of the lens to show more of the details and more of what was in the scene. The idea here is not to limit yourself to one particular perspective or angle of view. The idea is to pay attention to all the details at that particular location and find not only the best perspective, but to pay attention to those details so that you can create other images within the same scene. Many times you may start out with one particular photograph that you initially saw and then find that there's two or three other photographs that are even better of the same scene. Let's take a moment to look at the actual compositional values of this particular image. What I want to point out is not only the angle of view, but the elements within the shot itself. How the rocks come from basically the center of the frame and lead back into the frame, which drag you through the image. The next element to take a look at is the actual weed that is growing in the foreground. Look at the shadow detail. The shadow is actually coming toward us. In other words, the sun is coming from the front or behind the actual subject and to the right a bit. So what it's doing is casting a shadow towards us, which shows us depth. When that is actually coupled with all the other elements within the image, it actually creates the image itself. So we have a very smooth textured surface on the left, a very rough textured surface on the right, and then we have an element that brings us into the image and keeps us interested in looking at all the details within this particular image. In this next image, we have another simple wind drift. Though the image is interesting, it wouldn't have been very interesting had there not been an element in the lower right-hand corner of the image. Including other elements within your image to create some type of interest is what's important here. In this next image, what we've done is photograph multiple wind drifts in a huge landscape. Still wind drifts, but look at the shadows, look at the direction of the light, look at the elements within the image to create interest. Those are the things you want to pay attention to when you're going to photograph something like this. Now, imagine you're standing in this field and there's all of these wind drifts. After you shoot your initial image, pay attention to those details and create other images. The whole purpose of the Focus Spotlight video tutorial series is to get you to look at a specific subject matter in a certain way. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have your own vision. In fact, I encourage that. But what you want to take from these videos is vision, a different way of seeing things. Just remember, change the way you see and you change your photography forever. Thanks for joining me for this video tutorial, and I look forward to our next.